Hi there, I'm Corey Quinn, and thank you for coming to Quinnvent, my own version of AWS's own version of Google Cloud Next. That's a hell of a mouthful, but it is the official AWS reInvent branding. See, AWS sued a former employee, and Dr. Matt Wood, their VP of machine learning and other sundry things, wound up referring to it that way in a court document. Now, an AWS VP is never going to be off-brand, so that's its formal name. If they're not on the record then, they're never on the record at all. Now, before I dive in, I want to point out something here. AWS announced an awful lot of things yesterday, but everything that they announced is for someone. None of it is for everyone. So when you're looking at things thinking that it's not for you, that doesn't mean that you're not AWS's target customer. There's basically no one out there that tries to use every AWS service except possibly iRobot. Now, I'm going to get to each of these releases in turn, but I just want to call out first how each and every one of these horrible service names in some way fails AWS customers, AWS services, and most importantly of all, they fail me. Look at these awful service names. Gaze upon their awfulness, but not too far into it, lest that awfulness gaze back into you. Now, every AWS keynote likes to start by talking through some semblance of this, except that I actually pay artists to make it fun and engaging rather than dry and boring. So let's look at the various points on the compute spectrum. It is a spectrum, in fact. It goes from at least cloudy to most cloudy. Unlike everything else, I encourage you to shift right. Now, they always start with EC2 announcements, and it's not particularly exciting to most people, and it gets the least amount of press, but it has the single biggest billing impact to almost every AWS account out there. Something like 60% of global spend is still on EC2. Everything else winds up being relative pocket change. But, for example, they recently announced before reInvent started that they have P4DN instances that can do up to 400 gigabits per second. Now, if you take two of those and put them in different availability zones in the same region, you can transfer data at line rate between those two, and it'll cost you $1 per second. I don't advise it. Now, they announced a whole bunch of new instance types out there that I really wasn't paying attention to, because the unfortunate reality is there are still a shit ton of M1 instances, the original instance size, that are out there, because migrating a workload to newer instances is both scary and something that folks never really seem to get around to on their own. And personally, I don't give a toss about absolutely any of these things because it's not interesting. Instead, let's go right to the game changer for most of you, though you may not realize this, the new GP3 EBS volumes. Now, this is probably the #1 release of everything that's going to come all year long. They are faster and more performant than the default GP2 instances, and in fact, I would encourage you to convert them right the hell now, because every single stat increases. It's faster, it's more durable, and your price drops by 20%. You can do it in place without changing anything, though it does not support root volumes at the moment. Do it right now. I have one random customer I was looking to yesterday, and they're going to save a little over $200,000 a month with this simple change. There is no downside. Now, you probably don't need IO1 or IO2 volume types because those tend to be super focused on fast IO, but very often the limit is on the instance itself. EBS burst balance or EBS burst bytes are what get exhausted. You're never touching the IO capacity of the volumes themselves. Save money, go to GP3. Thank me later. In all of these talks, AWS loves to drag their customers out to say nice things about their services. And given that I'm basically ersatz Andy Jassy today, I'm going to do the same thing with one of my customers, Chaos Search. I got to sit down with their founder, CTO, and chief scientist, Thomas Hazel. We have a full Q&A coming out next week, but I want to have an excerpt of that for you right now. So You obviously had a choice of different directions that you could have gone in. You could have built this on GCP. You could have built this on Azure. You could have lost a bet and built this on top of IBM Cloud. Instead, you chose AWS. Why?
Well, Amazon, right? S3, it's just, there's now, I don't know how many exabytes are in S3, but everyone's dumping their data into cloud storage like S3. Amazon services naturally move data there. It was the natural starting point for Chaos Search, was that everybody was storing data in there, whether it was naturally because of web services or just a temporary storage. And so for us, Amazon was just a clear winner, clear favorite. There was no other cloud provider that we were going to go to first. And the thought was that go with where everyone's dumping data. All data roads lead to S3, seems like today.
We'll be able to hear a lot more from Thomas during our Q&A next week. Pay attention to requinvent.com to figure out exactly when that's going to be scheduled for. Now, AWS had a bit of a typo on the slides yesterday, which was super embarrassing. They announced both ECS Anywhere and EKS Anywhere. My God, can you imagine actually naming services that way? 6-syllable service names, 9 if you include the word Amazon, with only 1 letter of difference? That would be impossible to handle. Fortunately, it's not their actual service names. You have ECS Anywhere, which lets you run ECS on your own hardware on premises in your environment, or, another cloud provider somewhere, if such a thing were to actually exist. I've only heard vague rumors. The other service that they launched was actually called EKS Anywho, as in, why would I use EKS Anywho? Now, fortunately, AWS saw this coming and partnered with IBM last month to announce Red Hat OpenShift on AWS to solve for the incredibly pernicious what could be worse than EKS problem, because you always want to have a worse example to contrast a failing service with. Not that EKS is failing, but it's also not the best thing in the world. I will say that this whole dichotomy between ECS Anywhere and EKS Anywho are very odd. It's like ECS is trying to take on Kubernetes on-prem or in other clouds. To be honest, I kind of wish it would. Please don't email me about that opinion. Let's talk about some of the Lambda function enhancements that came out. The one that leaked a bit early, because it's really hard to roll these things out atomically, is instead of billing in 100 millisecond increments, they dropped that down to 1 millisecond increments. And the internet lost its ever-loving mind. They're super excited about this because something like a strong contingent of Lambda functions executes in something like 80 milliseconds, which means that you're knocking 20% off of those costs. But it's the Lambda bill. There aren't exactly a whole lot of big, expensive Lambda bills running around out there. It's generally a rounding error unless you're doing something super interesting. And if you are, please let me know. I'm always up to see new and exciting things. They've also gone ahead and increased the RAM limit from 3 gigabytes to 10 gigabytes. And at that scale, you get a full 6 virtual CPUs. That's kind of awesome, I guess. It's going to empower 2 or 3 awesome use cases and a universe of terrible ones, like so many things that AWS gives us. That other side of that sword is relatively sharp. And of course, to confuse absolutely everyone, Lambda now has container support. You can ship a Docker container up and run it as Lambda. They're still working out exactly how layers are going to work, but fundamentally, this makes the line between containers and functions incredibly blurry, and you're going to be confused as hell about this. I'm confused as hell about this, and I don't even tend to run containerized workloads. This is awesome for deployment and challenging for explaining these services to folks who are just dipping their toes into cloud. AWS is very proud of their new custom machine learning chip that they wound up releasing for training workloads, and they called it AWS Trainium. This demonstrates that AWS is perfectly willing to spend $500 million on chip development and about $4 on naming the chip that they just released. It's an interesting chip in that it's designed specifically to train workloads for ML purposes very quickly. But oh my God, the name. Knowing nothing other than that, I instinctively hate it. AWS also went ahead and announced AWS Proton. which is similar to Electron in that it runs on a bunch of RAM, but in this case, it's probably going to run on AWS's RAM instead of yours. It's like CodeStar, their entire pipeline of taking code from development to production with code build, code deploy, code pipeline, etc. But what Proton does, it acknowledges the fact that if you have a choice, you're probably not going to use all of those code-branded services, and instead lets you tag in alternate tools that you will actually use because they, work. Speaking of, let's also have a minute to listen to another word from one of our sponsors, Gitlab. I'm told it is not pronounced Gitlab, but I'm not willing to wade into that particular mess.
The landscape of software development is changing. Today's users expect applications that are always on and accessible everywhere. To keep up, centralized apps are shifting to distributed cloud services, built and run by teams all around the world. With all of this complexity, software teams need a DevOps solution that enables them to become faster and more efficient while staying secure and reliable. Luckily, there's Gitlab, a complete DevOps platform delivered as a single application. Get powerful collaboration capabilities like agile planning, version control, and code review, multi-cloud CI/CD that enables you to deploy anywhere, and built-in security and monitoring right out of the box. Gitlab makes you fast, so you can meet business demand and react to disruptions. Gitlab makes you efficient, helping you improve productivity, reduce rework, and work from anywhere. All while helping you build and maintain trust as you reduce vulnerabilities, streamline auditing, and stay compliant. What's more, everyone can contribute to this open source application, so Gitlab is continuously improving. Are you ready to deliver better products faster, work more efficiently, and reduce security and compliance risk? Try Gitlab today.
The other side of Proton, even though it's not actually similar in any way, but I think that they juxtapose super well, is Monitoron. It's a service that monitors your workers and machines across a factory floor, which I don't tend to have too many of around here, but what do I know? I don't care. I wanted to make the joke about AWS spending all of their money on comics instead of naming services well. I don't think they actually did that. I think they spent it on something else instead of naming services well. But here we are. It was also disclosed, and I found this very interesting, and I want to take a bit of a detour into it, that Aurora is AWS's fastest growing service. Why? And more importantly, how? I, and much more importantly, my large customers, spin up a lot more Lambda functions, S3 objects, EC2 instances, containers, etc., than we do, databases. How the hell are you measuring growth? Is that just one customer? This provisioning script got stuck in a loop that every time it runs, it has no idea of idempotence and spins up a new database every time? Like, what is that? Is that customer Wells Fargo? I hear they have problems like that. It just doesn't make sense to me. I'm sure there's something I'm missing. How do you measure growth? So Docker Hub is a thing that everyone loved. It was a free service that Docker wound up giving away based upon their chronic aversion to charging money for things that people want. Eventually that well started running dry and they began charging for anonymous access and rate limiting it. So AWS is stepping into the role of free anonymous access without a business model because unlike Docker these days, AWS can afford to. Now let's talk a little bit about Sagemaker. Not because I want to, but because it's impossible to talk to an Amazonian for more than 3 minutes without them bringing it up. Sagemaker was designed to be an introduction to machine learning that's both accessible and friendly. Because these days, there's nothing friendlier than going to the Sagemaker page for the first time and seeing 40 services that all start with the word Sagemaker. It's incredibly off-putting, and it's kind of a shame, because when it first came out, I polled the readership of last week in AWS of, is anyone using this for anything? And if so, what? I got a couple dozen answers, and they all started with some variant of, I'm using it for some weird story. Now, I'm not a data scientist, but that told me that they have something when it comes to Sagemaker, because they're getting people who aren't themselves inspired to go ahead and make money by never deleting anything into experimenting with this and getting business value from it. There's something there. It needs to be more accessible. But of course, they announced a few services that they wound up slapping ridiculous names onto, like Sagemaker Feature Store. Despite calling it a store, you can't actually buy anything from it. That would be the AWS Marketplace, where you can buy anything, just so long as a sufficiently mighty/large AWS partner is selling it. It's really just a bunch of pre-trained nonsense that you can make available within your organization, and they call that the feature store. Exciting. Now, I think that SageMaker Data Wrangler does data cleanup and normalization, but honestly, I wasn't paying attention because I was too busy spraying coffee across my monitor at the terrible name of Data Wrangler. That sounds like it's cowboy time. Now, there's a whole other machine learning keynote, and God alone knows what else they're going to be shoving our way in the SageMaker space, but thankfully, this is where they stopped yesterday. So, once upon a time, I wound up talking to a colleague who was managing people, and he was talking about a terrible candidate that had something ridiculous on their resume. Oh, what was that? I asked. Azure DevOps, as if that's actually a skill. It's not a skill, it's a service. You know you have utterly failed when you name a service something that causes damage to people who are putting it on their resume. It's some sort of CI/CD dingus. Great. Now, I've been making fun of this for years, very publicly, and AWS, in typical fashion, said, yep, we can top that. And so they did with Amazon DevOps Guru. Code Guru was the original version of this that analyzed your code on every check-in and wound up spitting out recommendations of what's going to be expensive lines of code. Now, the problem, of course, is the expensive lines of code are the ones that you put through Code Guru because it bills you per line of code, a metric that your engineers never had to think about until now. Incidentally, Code Guru now supports Python, which is great for those of us who don't know Java, but I'm terrified of what it's about to do to my terrible code and my less terrible bill. Now, the challenge with DevOps Guru, despite the terrible name, is that it's charging fractions of a penny per hour for every monitored resource in your boundary, which, okay, sure, whatever, the pricing's dumb, but that's not the big problem here. My problem is that the entire premise of the service is flawed. Why? I have a DevOps background. Every time you wind up seeing something in the DevOps space breaking, what happens is that sysadmin work or SRE work or DevOps, whatever the hell you want to call it this year, I don't care, just pay me, is fundamentally about yak shaving. It's about find the weird edge case that this time broke everything instead of just passing by harmlessly. Now, there have been a bunch of companies that have attempted this before. I personally fail to see how this is not going to fall into the same trap that they did of continually fighting the last incident, but we'll see. And I do want to see how this winds up costing in an actual production account that's semi-complicated. This is going to be something to keep an eye on. Let's change gears a little bit and talk about QuickSight Q. And there are a couple problems here. One, it is completely impossible to search for anything, including a custom language named Q. Good luck. I know they don't like Google, but I need to be able to Google things. Two, this pisses me off. Because what QuickSight Q does is lets you ask arbitrary questions and spit back useful information, but I can't use it because QuickSight as a whole is molten garbage compared to Tableau. And I don't say this as a Tableau fanboy. Tableau is expensive, it is an incredibly enterprise-heavy sales process start to finish, and I resent having to renew my licenses every year. In fact, whenever it comes up, I desperately try to see if QuickSight has improved to a point where we can finally wind up using it, and the answer continues to be no. I don't think this is likely to be the tipping point. I'm glad to see services improving, but this one ain't it on its own. AWS QuickSight team, please call me. Now, there are other two services from the industrial/IoT space that were released. Lookout for Equipment and Lookout for Vision, which were apparently named after some shit that someone saw while touring a warehouse. I assign this as Lookout for Equipment. Great. When Werner gives his keynote in a couple of weeks, what's the answer going to be there? Is he going to announce a new industrial IoT service called Holy Shit, Watch Out for the Bear? It's about as sensible as these ridiculous names go. Now, AWS has multiple priorities here, and I want to be very clear that this is what they're going for. The first and driving requirement with all of these releases is to help customers. They don't build things just so they can say they have them or check a box on some Gartner Magic Quadrant inclusion criteria. It's because some customer somewhere has a problem, and that's why these services were built. But the other side of it, though, is that AWS is extraordinarily opinionated about what they're doing. And the reason behind that is that they'll meet customers where they are, but only to a point. Beyond that point, customers are on mainframes and don't want to move. They're not going to release an AWS 400 anytime soon. Instead, they're going to say, we'll go this far, but no more this year. And we've seen them coming out of the regions into the edge in a bunch of different ways. Outposts, smaller version. They have a bunch of different things that are helping in this space, but it's not necessarily giving customers everything they want. It's helping prod them along to a brighter future and a better tomorrow. And of course, the last thing that Amazon wants to do is give all of these things absolutely terrible names. Now, an Amazonian would look at that list and say, holy crap, we forgot security. Quick, let's put it at the beginning and call it job zero. Security is job zero because you forget it until the very end and have to bolt it in like it wasn't an afterthought. You'd think that was a joke, but honestly, we've all worked in InfoSec to some degree. What do you think? Thank you very much for listening to my keynote rebuttal and a whirlwind tour of all the nonsense that AWS has released. I'll be doing a bunch of interactive Q&A sessions, summarization of what's going on, and basically being your guide for the next 3 weeks so you don't have to. Be sure to catch the schedule and give me grief at requinvent.com. I'm cloud economist Corey Quinn. Thank you for listening to my shenanigans.